Wonderful. So welcome everyone to the MIT SSP Wednesday seminar, and a special welcome to those who are tuning in via our live stream on YouTube. I'm really delighted today to welcome Rebecca Lissner, who will be speaking about an exciting new book that just came out. Rebecca is an assistant professor in the Strategic and Operational Research Department at the U.S. Naval War College, so sort of a kindred institution not too far from us in Rhode Island. She's held fellowships at all the usual places, the Perry World House at the University of Pennsylvania, Council on Foreign Relations as a Stanton postdoctoral fellow, and also at Yale University's International Security Studies program as a Brady Johnson predoctoral fellow. Her research focuses on international security and American foreign policy. Her writings have been published or are forthcoming in Political Science Quarterly, International Security, the Texas National Security Review, Survival, Presidential Studies Quarterly, and International Peacekeeping. In addition to the book that she'll be talking about today, she has another manuscript in process or still in the works that examines how military interventions shape great powers' grand strategies. So I'm really delighted to welcome you, Rebecca, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Taylor, and thanks to all of you for making the time to be with me here today. It's always a pleasure to see and address this group, and I see many friendly faces on the screen, so that's really a delight. I have to give my requisite Naval War College disclaimer that, of course, I'm speaking only in my personal capacity, not in any institutional capacity here today. So I am absolutely delighted to be speaking with you all about a new book that I recently published with Mira Rapp-Hooper. I have my handy author's copy right here. It's called An Open World: How America Can Win the Contest for 21st Century Order. And this book is really a call to action. It makes the case that the United States has to reimagine its foreign policy for a post-pandemic and potentially, we'll find out soon, post-Trump world before it is too late. And my co-author, Mira Rapp-Hooper, and I began this book in the immediate wake of the 2016 election, when it was already clear to us that Donald Trump himself was more an avatar than an architect of the massive domestic and international changes that were reshaping US foreign policy. Because the fact is that even if Hillary Clinton had won the presidency in 2016, she too would have had to contend with adverse global power shifts, rapid technological change, and acute domestic political dysfunction at home. So in crafting this book, Mira and I set out to push back against two pieces of conventional wisdom that were really dominating the debate about grand strategy and international order, and still to some extent persist to this day. And the first was the notion that President Trump himself was solely responsible for the collapse of American international influence and the so-called liberal international order. And the second related assumption was the hope that the United States could return to foreign policy business as usual once Trump left office, whether in 2021 or 2025. So by investigating the long-term domestic and international shifts that both predated the Trump presidency and will outlast it, our research actually in many ways anticipated the foreign policy emergency that Washington now so obviously faces in the wake of the COVID pandemic. Because COVID in many ways has tragically illustrated the central thesis of our book, which is that an international order that was built for the world of the 1940s is utterly ill-equipped to meet the challenges and the opportunities of the 2040s. So a new approach is quite clearly required. But before I go into what that approach should entail, let's talk a little bit more about what these trends are that are transforming America's global role. So to begin at the international level, to put it simply, American military and economic primacy has come to an end, as West to East power shifts and technological change have fueled China's rise, and by extension undermined a US-led international order that no longer reflects geopolitical or technological realities. So as many of you have surely studied, fueled by several decades of rapid growth, China's economy is already the world's largest by some measures, the second largest by other measures. And in many ways, its military power has expanded in parallel. And while China rose within a US-led order, it now clearly seeks to revise elements of that order to better reflect its own power and preferences, whether in the South China Sea or at the World Trade Organization. But even as sharpening US-China rivalry is going to be exceptionally important in determining the future of international order, the international landscape is actually substantially more complex than a bipolar framework would suggest. Because in many ways, the US-China rivalry will actually be nested within an international system that is increasingly multipolar in character. Russia is declining, but remains capable of revanchist disruption. Numerous emerging economies in the Indo-Pacific, led by India, will contribute to a region with diverse economic power centers. And despite the United States allies' demographic and economic stagnation, they remain capable in critical domains of competition, such as the provision of economic development aid and high-tech innovation. At the same time as global power is shifting, we've already also seen concurrent rapid technological change and innovation that demands new models of both domestic and international governance. Indeed, the rapid pace of technological change is reconfiguring the state-society relationships that are at the heart of all nations' power. And we've seen China leading at the forefront of a new model of techno-authoritarianism that could confer considerable competitive advantages. At the same time as new models of domestic technological governance are being pioneered, the existing international order is becoming increasingly outmoded, which requires new forms of international governance. And examples of this abound because there are no meaningful global rules for cyberspace, like any kind of guardrails or restrictions surrounding attacks on critical infrastructure, whether energy grids or electoral infrastructure. There are no meaningful global rules governing the internet, for example, protections for your data when you use a foreign-owned app like TikTok. And there are also no meaningful global rules surrounding AI, automation, and other emerging technologies, like limits on the use of autonomous weapons in warfare. So in many ways, these two international trends of global power shifts and rapid technological change actually intersect with each other. Great powers are increasingly competing in the tech domain for economic, military, and political advantage. And constructing a new global technological order is itself a contested pursuit. Because China is now seeking to write global rules that protect its domestic model of techno-authoritarianism and that advance its commercial interests globally, while the US is in many ways struggling to craft its own vision for tech governance both at home and abroad. So that's kind of a snapshot of the international picture. But in many ways, as the United States sets out to craft a post-primacy, post-pandemic, potentially post-Trump approach, it faces some significant domestic challenges. And in many ways, these domestic challenges might actually prove more determinative of America's future international position. Even before the pandemic hit this year, domestic divisions were already causing the United States to operate below its own capacity, as American global strategy was hobbled by partisan polarization and misalignment between the federal government and the American technology sector. So turning first to partisan polarization, this is a long-term trend, as Democrats and Republicans are increasingly sorting into two opposing blocs. And we see this throughout all different facets of American political life. We see it in Congress as centrist legislators have all but disappeared from both parties, and strict party line votes like the one we saw on the Barrett nomination or confirmation this week are becoming increasingly common. We see this in the segmented information flows, for example, the proliferation of partisan think tanks in Washington that push both parties farther to the extremes by providing tailored policy solutions that fit certain political agendas. And we also see it pervading the American public, which increasingly consumes information through polarized media ecosystems, whereby Democrats and Republicans are decreasingly capable of agreeing on basic common sets of facts. And overlaying all of this is the additional trend of effective polarization, whereby Democrats and Republicans have actually begun to actively dislike each other, which makes the very act of compromise unpalatable to both the mass public and elites as well. And partisan polarization has many pernicious consequences, but some of them are quite specific to foreign policy. Partisan polarization makes it much harder for the United States to develop and implement long-term strategy. It can create dramatic swings when the White House changes hands between Democrats and Republicans, Republicans and Democrats. It can encourage political leaders to back irresponsible policies without any fear of recourse from their loyal political bases. And in many ways, it abets foreign interference in our domestic electoral processes by making manifest to outside adversaries the many fissures that do separate the American public from each other, and also creating strong disincentives for whichever party benefits from election interference to actually crack down on that behavior and defend American democracy, a phenomenon that's been on pretty stark display over the past few years and that we are in many ways living through once again right now. But partisan polarization isn't the only division that is hampering American foreign policy. There's another division that exists between the federal government and the United States domestic technology sector. As technological change and its diffusion increasingly remake geopolitics, the United States' ability to harness its tech sector to its national competitive advantage will be critical. But the problem is that over the past several decades, the federal government has dramatically underinvested in basic science and technology, far below Cold War levels. So whereas the federal government was spending something on the order of 2% of GDP on R&D and basic science in the 70s, today that number is closer to 0.7%. And this underinvestment has a number of grave effects, but one of them is a misalignment of incentives between the public and private sector and tech sector on national security issues. Because in the absence of this federal investment, tech companies are left to fill the gap themselves. They chase profits and they chase foreign markets. And in order to do so, they also seek to create more distance from Washington in an effort to shore up the purported neutrality of their systems. At the same time, this estrangement has also led to an atrophy of tech talent in the government, which makes it harder for the US to procure and adopt commercial technologies, especially in the defense space, and also makes it harder for the United States to effectively regulate tech companies on a whole range of issues. And over the past year, we've seen that COVID in many ways unites these two trends and shows that our domestic underinvestments and our domestic divisions are even graver than we knew. The gap between national purpose and the tech sector has made it quite difficult for the United States to launch a tech-enabled contact tracing program. At the same time as partisan polarization has actually infected the use of masks as a public health response, resulting in their politicization and actually worsening the pandemic in many ways. So if you zoom out, in many ways, this amounts to a pretty consistent picture of the United States. The United States is a country that is still exceptionally powerful by many metrics. It still has among the world's largest economies, if not the largest. It still has the only military capable of global power projection. The US dollar remains the global reserve currency, and the US has unrivaled centrality in global financial networks. We have a tremendous domestic engine of innovation, and we also have a peerless system of international alliances. But despite all of these considerable strengths, the United States is operating tragically below its own capacity. So what these trends suggest is that the order, often referred to as the liberal international order, cannot endure. Whatever power the United States might have had during the unipolar moment to craft order unilaterally and/or universally, according to its own liberal preferences, has now dissipated. An international order, of course, refers to the norms, the rules, and the institutions that govern international politics. And order always fundamentally rests on the global distribution of power. It always reflects the preferences of great powers and the leading states in any international system. But it's not simply reducible to the distribution of power. It also reflects specific grand strategic choices that are taken by leading states in any system, as well as dense webs of interstate interaction that entrench predictable patterns of state behavior. So with this in mind, it becomes clear that, of course, the liberal international order, to the extent that it ever existed, was just one form of possible order. It was one that had Wilsonian origins, that was established by the United States and victorious allies after World War II. But of course, it was never fully liberal, fully international, or fully ordered. The UN system itself was universal, but as the Cold War coalesced and the superpower standoff hardened, there were increasingly two opposing camps of order that were layered on top. And even the order itself evolved over time with decolonization, and it experienced crises like in the 1970s with the stresses on the Bretton Woods system. But for all that something approaching a liberal order existed in the Cold War, it was really only after the collapse of the USSR that the liberal international order really surged to prominence as a term. And it really only then seemed capable of becoming universal, as the United States' unrivaled power seemed to support the inexorable spread of liberal politics and markets to all corners of the globe. This was sort of the idea that history had somehow ended and all countries were going to converge around a certain set of common liberal ideals and politics. But of course, that hasn't actually happened. And if it wasn't obvious before COVID, I think it's quite clear today that American primacy is over. China is continuing its ascent as an illiberal great power. International power is diffusing, and the mechanisms of global cooperation that had been established after World War II, after the Cold War, are collapsing under this accumulated pressure. So if the international order cannot endure as it was, the question then becomes, what comes next? And in our book, we argue that the coming decades are going to feature a contest over the future of international order. And what that means is that the emerging order to come is not going to be universal in nature. Instead, it's going to be layered and it's going to be differentiated with distinct regimes, each with different participants for various regions and domains, even as some legacy institutions that do have universal membership, like the UN, will endure alongside some new governing constructs. And as the US and China increasingly offer competing ordering visions, the preferences and alignments of middle powers are actually going to prove quite determinative of the shape of future order on many political, economic, security, and technological issues. So to navigate this new geopolitical landscape that the United States will find, our book argues that Washington needs a new strategy. And in particular, what it needs to do is to shift away from this vision of liberal universalism that was really at the heart of its post-Cold War grand strategy, and instead embrace a concept of openness as the guiding principle of its grand strategy and approach to international order moving forward. We argue that an openness strategy would allow the United States to secure its dearest interests and values, even though it has lost military and economic primacy. So what exactly does an openness strategy entail? Well, the central objective of an openness strategy is to keep the world open and to promote interactions of the same kind between states, that is, through open and transparent international institutions. So what that means in practice is, first, that all states should be able to make free and independent political choices without foreign interference in their domestic decision-making processes and without outright domination by a more powerful nation. It means, second, that international waterways, airspace, and outer space must all remain open and accessible for commercial and military transit. So countries like China or Iran should not be able to restrict or close off transit through vital waterways like the South China Sea or the Straits of Hormuz. And third, global cooperation and trade should proceed through international institutions that are governed transparently and modernized for 21st century challenges. And when you think through these sort of three core tenets of an openness strategy, it becomes clear that there's really only one major power that both has preferences for closure and the means to achieve them. And that country, of course, is China. China could make a bid for hegemony in traditional terms in Asia, for example, through the annexation of territory in neighboring states. But it could also exert its dominance using subtler 21st century means, like the use of 5G digital infrastructure to undermine the political independence of other states, whether neighbors in Asia or even non-contiguous states that might be anywhere else in the world. But in isolating this challenge that China poses to an open world, we're certainly not implying that China or any other country can't have influence. In fact, we fully expect that as a rising power, China will have considerable influence. Openness also doesn't encompass all of America's interests. Like all grand strategies, this is a framework in which the US can make discrete policy choices. And it's also important to clarify that openness does not exist without limits. States will still regulate their borders. They don't need to give up their sovereignty. And under emergency conditions like the pandemic we're living through right now, some forms of closure may indeed be necessary. And just to underscore the significance of this departure, let me highlight a couple of ways, or a few ways, in which openness departs from liberal universalism. So first, it acknowledges the need to live alongside a powerful, authoritarian China that is in many ways within the international order, but is unfortunately unlikely to liberalize anytime soon, which means that the US and China will be competing on many issues and competing to write the rules for future order, while it will also have to cooperate as mutual interests may dictate on areas of shared concern. Second, an openness strategy recognizes that the United States does not need to dominate the world or to engage in regime change, whether armed or otherwise, to preserve its safety, security, and prosperity. But what it does need to do is rally other countries behind a shared ordering vision. And finally, in building diverse coalitions for openness, our strategy seeks to include liberal as well as illiberal states or mixed regimes, understanding that ordering preferences are not strictly coextensive with regime type. So in practice, if the US were to set out to implement this openness strategy, there would be three policy pillars that Washington would have to enact. The first pillar is order modernization. With the liberal international order in its rearview mirror, an openness strategy would set out to rebuild one for the 21st century. That would entail, in some instances, modernizing existing international institutions like the UN Security Council or the WTO in collaboration with allies and partners. But it's also going to require a lot of hard work to develop new regimes in or undergoverned areas in which Washington has a clear interest in setting open norms and rules. And that includes climate, that includes trade, emerging tech, cyber, and internet governance. The second pillar of an openness strategy is a new set of national security choices. Today, the American foreign policy apparatus is dramatically under-equipped for the international environment that we will confront over the next few decades, as great power competition with China will span economic, technological, ideological, and military domains, while the perils of borderless challenges like climate change and pandemics become ever more urgent. So that preparation begins with a rebalance away from the Department of Defense that makes diplomacy and development the leading instrument of American foreign policy. And it's also going to require creative new forms of coordination, both within the government, between the US government and with its own private sector, and also with partner nations, potentially to include public-private partnerships that may span many countries, like a 5G or AI consortium that pools efforts to develop cutting-edge technology and provide alternatives to China. And the third pillar is domestic renewal. This, of course, begins with renewing American competitiveness, something that is no small task amidst a massive public health crisis. But the fact is that we can't just end with domestic reconstruction post-COVID. Instead, Washington needs to work really hard to bring governmental capacity in line with its power. That means bridging the divide between the tech sector and the government through game-changing investments in R&D and basic science. It means breaking down barriers to the flow of talent between public and private sectors, and also reforming the government's procurement processes so that it's better equipped to work with cutting-edge agile startups. It also means taking steps to insulate foreign policy from partisan polarization by embedding an openness strategy within nonpartisan public-private and international partnerships. And finally, the success of an openness strategy really does require greater domestic resilience, whether that's medical supply stockpiles or more secure supply chains, so that we can withstand the negative externalities that do necessarily come with participation in an open world. So before I wrap up, I just want to make one final point, which is that we are at a critical inflection point, and the opportunity that the United States faces today will not come again. We are probably at the most consequential world ordering moment since at least the end of the Cold War, and maybe since World War II. And that means that the US has a small and narrowing window of opportunity to revamp its grand strategy, to abandon its post-Cold War hubris in favor of a new approach that is both disciplined and globally engaged. Because the fact is that America remains exceptionally powerful. And if it can muster sufficient political will, Washington can turn this moment of destruction into a moment of creation. But if it fails to do so, the results will be quite grave. We'll see authoritarian rivals like China consolidate their power, and the world will become increasingly hostile to US interests and values. And moreover, without American leadership on global challenges, I expect that the pandemic that we're living through right now could actually just prove a mild harbinger of much worse disorder to come. So on that note of both optimism and pessimism, I will wrap up and very much look forward to your questions and comments. Thanks.
Wonderful, Rebecca, that was terrific. So the floor is open. If you'd like to get in the queue on the Zoom, please raise your hand, and also on YouTube, please put questions in the chat. And oh, okay, this is just a, wow, you've really, I've never seen more blue hands this early on in a presentation. So, okay, we're gonna work from the bottom up because why not? First question to Rachel Teacott. Rachel, if you could turn on your video and ask your question.
Video and audio good?
Video and audio good.
All right, thank you, Rebecca, so much. My question, well, I have a few, but I'll stick to one given the list. What is the role of the military in openness grand strategy? What changes would you make to force structure and force presence around the world to bring the US military into kind of alignment with openness? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Rachel, nice to see you. And thanks for the great question. So the role of the military in an openness strategy is in many ways a diminished one. If you think about what our military strategy has looked like over the past several decades, so much of it has been consumed with fighting military interventions, whether in Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya, that are in many ways guided by the concepts of liberal universalism, the idea that we do need to spread US-style democracy to other countries, including those that have radically different political systems, and that the military is the best way to do that. An openness strategy really rejects that approach to armed overseas regime change and that approach to democracy promotion, but also it diminishes the role of the military in a number of other ways. For example, by imposing an exceptionally high bar on the use of military force in any given instance. Now, in practice, what this means is that our strategy seeks to allocate the considerable military strength that we do have according to a pretty clear prioritization of regions. For all of the reasons that I described before, it is quite clear that China is itself the chief antagonist to openness. And so if the United States is to keep the Indo-Pacific region open, that needs to be where it concentrates the largest number of its forces, including by bolstering our alliances in that region. What that means then is that the US needs to draw down in other places. The threat from Russia, while certainly nothing to scoff at, is substantially less threatening than the one from China. And in many ways, our European allies and partners are well poised to be at the front lines of deterrence in Europe. So we should be able to draw down American presence in Europe alongside clear efforts to improve the readiness of NATO And also to recognize that many of the threats that Russia may pose to our European allies aren't going to be primarily military in nature and can be addressed by renovating NATO to also address non-military threats like the ones posed by political interference. And then to sort of realize this vision of a much less militarized American foreign policy, you would see a substantial drawdown of the American military presence in the Middle East. There simply is not a sufficient threat to openness that is presented in that region to justify the positioning of so many forces there as we have had over the past several decades. And so instead, what we advocate for is a very, very light footprint in that region, sufficient to provide early warning in case there is a brewing threat that poses an imminent national security danger to the United States, but certainly not to impose any kind of order in the Middle East, understanding that that quest has been largely elusive over recent memory. Now, the one caveat to that is that freedom of navigation to include in the Middle East is exceptionally important. And there are interesting opportunities for cooperation, not just with allies, but also with Russia, with China, with India, in trying to keep the Straits of Hormuz open, and of course the Suez Canal as well.
Great, wonderful, thanks. So next up, excuse me, Renata Joyce. Renata, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you for such an interesting talk, Rebecca. I think my one question is, could you say a little more about how you see an openness strategy differing from say a containment strategy, right? So when you were talking about the ways that it varies from liberal universalism, recognizing the need to live alongside an illiberal great power, recognizing the US doesn't need to dominate the world, like it includes liberal as well as illiberal regimes. And so, maybe we should, if we say, okay, let's step back from this post collapse of the Soviet Union moment when you had this emergence of liberal universalism, there seems to be a lot of parallels between those things that you described and actually what the international order looked like during the Cold War. And so, how is it different now? And so, for example, one of the things that you were talking about was this recognizing the need, we don't need to change regimes. We don't need to promote democracy by force. Like that was, there's no need, there's no place for that in this new order. And it's true, the US, for example, during the Cold War did not try to promote democracy by force per se. But it did get involved in regime change, right? It was concerned not necessarily about the content of the politics, but the influence over other countries. And it did sort of intervene in ways that, sometimes proved pretty disastrous to try and, keep out illiberal influences. And so, how does the US avoid that in an openness strategy? And are there key parallels or differences from containment for the order that you're proposing? Thank you.
Thanks, it's nice to see you too. So many friendly faces here, which makes this especially fun. Another great question. So I suppose I would make several points here. So the first is that, of course, openness is not an entirely new idea to American foreign relations. In many ways, it has a venerable history in American foreign policy. When FDR was beginning to articulate his vision for post-war organization, he in many ways had this idea of an open sphere of influence, the idea that, of course, the Soviet Union would exert substantial influence over large parts of Eurasia, but at the same time that perhaps that area could remain permeable to American commercial, diplomatic, and other types of access. Now, of course, as the Iron Curtain descended, that initial concept of openness proved impossible to achieve, and the Soviet Union did entirely close off its sphere of influence. But I think there are reasons to expect that openness could be substantially more attainable today than it was during the Cold War. Whereas the US and the Soviet Union, as you know, had very few economic ties between them, and the Western and Eastern blocs had very few economic ties. Today, we live in a world that is profoundly economically interdependent, to include the interdependence between the US and China. And I think that substantially alters the incentives that any great power would face in trying to establish a closed sphere of influence. Put simply, the costs are much greater of opting out of a globalized economy than they were in 1945 or in the 1950s. At the same time as the benefits of participation, to include, network effects and the ability to specialize and use comparative advantage and to occupy certain places in the global supply chain, all of those are much greater. So I think there's reason to be optimistic that this idea of openness is more achievable today than it was when it foundered and sort of converted to a containment strategy back in the Cold War. Now, one last point I would make here is that, of course, containment strategies are not simply relegated to the dustbin of history. There are many people who are out there advocating them right now. And so a crucial point of distinction that I would make between an openness strategy and these sort of neo-containment visions is that this is not a strategy that seeks to divide the world into two opposing blocks defined on ideological lines. In fact, it accepts that there's going to be quite a bit of permeability between those countries that align with the US, those countries that align with China, and indeed, single countries may align with China on some issues, with the United States on other issues, and perhaps with neither on still other issues. So we really need to eschew the rigidity of this sort of Cold War style bloc mentality, because this is not going to be a Manichaean ideological standoff of the kind that we saw in the Cold War. And the US will be more successful if it engages in the sort of agile multipolar diplomacy that's required for this moment, rather than trying to replicate what it might perceive as having been the successes of its Cold War strategies.
Great, thanks. So given the very large number of blue hands on my screen, I'm going to start grouping questions, but also with the proviso, just in groups of two, but with the proviso that one question per customer, please. Otherwise, I want to try to get through as many as we can before 1 o'clock, although we may not make it all the way through the list. So next up, first, Nick Ackert, and then on deck, Apeksha Prasad. So Nick, over to you.
Hi, Rebecca. Thank you so much for this. I really enjoyed it because my own research concerns the balancing decisions of countries in Southeast Asia, and I appreciated your comments about middle power coalition building being an important pillar of the openness strategy. And so my question is, what kinds of factors are more or less likely to make these regional states want to cooperate with the US? And obviously, we do face the roadblock, as you mentioned. I think Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell had a piece about this in Foreign Affairs that, just as you said, it is possible to both cooperate and compete simultaneously. So how strong are those coalitions, together, and what makes those countries make the balancing decisions that they do, if we could even call it balancing?
Great, thanks, Nick. Apeksha.
Hi, Rebecca. Thank you for the talk. I wanted to follow up on your point about how regime type is not necessarily coterminous with order preferences, and ask whether authoritarian states can pursue a grand strategy of openness, and how the pillars of living with liberal and illiberal states and pursuing a grand strategy that emphasizes development is different from what China is doing right now.
Great, thanks. All right, back to you, Rebecca.
Great, thank you. So first to Nick, what will make regional states want to cooperate with the US? Well, it sounds like in many ways your research could speak to this in a much more specific sense. But what we try to do with this strategy is to recognize that precisely because future order will in many ways be disaggregated. It's not fully opt into a vision of sort of universal liberalism or fully opt out. It actually creates space to recognize where there are interest convergences with regional states, including those that aren't themselves liberal democracies. So, in your region, I think here of Vietnam, which in many ways shares at least some of the United States preferences when it comes to openness. I think Vietnam certainly stands to benefit from participation in an open economic order. It certainly stands to benefit from maintaining its position on the global supply chain. It also stands to benefit from a sort of free and open Indo-Pacific as defined by open global commons in the South China Sea and the prevention of Chinese domination there. So I think that's a good example, and Singapore would be another one. And of course, even India, which is itself, arguably the most important hinge state, is not going to align with the United States on every issue. I think even as we've seen greater alignment, even with the defense agreement signed this week between the U.S. and India recently, and of course, brought upon by the increasing tensions in the Himalayas between China and India. I mean, nevertheless, India itself is undergoing massive domestic liberalization. And you think about something like internet shutdowns in Kashmir, which actually align India much more with a Chinese-like view of cyber sovereignty than it does with a sort of US model of the future of internet governance. So I think the most important thing is just to recognize that these alignments are not going to be permanent, and they're not going to be the same across the board, which is, I get going back to Rachel's question, why diplomacy is going to be so important, and why the United States really does need to build up the capacity to engage with all these countries. Yes, sometimes in ways that have to do with mill ties, but also in ways that have to do with diplomacy and sussing out what these power strategies and interests actually are, how they do intersect with ours, and how we can leverage those to build sort of new forms of order across these different domains. To the next question from sorry, I'm probably gonna say your name wrong, Apeksha, sorry. So what can authoritarian countries do openness, and how is this different from China, what China is doing? Well, I think that the answer is that, authoritarian countries might buy in, again, to certain elements of openness, and that's actually a critical piece of this strategy. So you mentioned, BRI, for example. I think it is a definite possibility that the United States can work with allies and partners, including in Europe and elsewhere, to increasingly nudge China in the direction of openness and transparency with BRI. We saw it happen with AIIB, admittedly a much smaller scale initiative, but one in which the sort of engagement of Western countries resulted in a governance structure that actually looks substantially similar to other development institutions. So there are also other areas, if you think about, on climate governance or even certain forms of trade governance, where we might be able to find convergence between authoritarian powers and an openness strategy. That being said, I think there are going to be other areas where authoritarian powers like China don't actively embrace openness. Certainly, there are things about their domestic structures. For example, the way that China handles its domestic internet militates in favor of a view of internet governance that is pretty fundamentally at odds with openness. So we're not going to see convergence on all issues, but I think the whole notion of the pivot away from sort of liberalism as the organizing principle to openness as the organizing principle is designed to create space for those forms of cooperation, whether amongst great powers or amongst the United States and other middle powers, even if they are not themselves liberal democracies.
Great, thank you. So the next pair will be Catherine Tai and Julian Rippey. So Catherine, you first, please, and then Julian, you're next.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for that talk. That was really interesting. I have one major question that was also asked in chat, which is, what makes you think that the US can actually credibly advocate openness, and specifically any of the changes that you proposed for the international order? I think especially given a lot of the trust that has been lost in recent years, but also in areas such as, for instance, internet governance, you could argue that both Europe and China have much more coherent existing visions. So I think the big question is, what makes you think that the US can be a credible leader across all of these areas, and then specifically advocating openness?
Great. Julian.
So this is actually a pretty fortuitous pairing, because my question is very similar. It's basically just thinking about the reality of how the Supreme Court is going to go in the United States in the near term, likely, with a conservative domination of it. Do you think that, especially on these key issues of internet or technology governance and climate governance, do you think that the United States has even the legal infrastructure to comply with sweeping international agreements, or is there something in the polarization of American politics that will make that difficult to pull off?
Great, thanks. Back to you, Rebecca.
So both great questions. So I guess I'll begin with Julian's question about whether we have the legal infrastructure to comply. I think the answer is quite clearly yes, but I would also just add something of a caveat in terms of how these future elements of order are going to be structured. I tend to think that all of the international trends that we talked about, sort of both the un and undergoverned nature of all these emerging spaces, intersecting with the kind of sharpening nature of US-China competition and to a lesser extent US-Russia competition, is going to mean that we're not going to see a lot of new sort of binding international treaties of the sort that might have characterized international order in the past. And actually, I think cooperation is probably going to be often much less formal and also much less binding in nature. And so to that extent, I think it raises fewer legal questions of the kind that have historically arisen around, whether certain international treaties might violate American sovereignty, those being the only ones I can really think of that would get kicked up to the Supreme Court in the same way that you're describing. But sort of conversely, I think it gets to Catherine's question, which is how can the United States credibly participate in especially international agreements that maybe have shorter time horizons or are less formal in nature at a time when we haven't always stood up for openness in recent times. And I do think that there is a trust deficit that the United States is going to have to overcome in sort of recommitting to some of its historic tenets of foreign policy and also advocating and articulating new ones. But, in many ways, this just comes back to power, right? The United States still has significant latitude to set the terms, whether, that is in international trade agreements, whether that has to do with how we regulate technology domestically, such that other countries simply have to respond. And to the extent that we can actually broaden these coalitions, those incentives are only going to be even stronger. And so I don't think it rests on sort of credibility alone to do this work. Now, in the tech governance space, you raise a really interesting point, which is that to the extent the US has articulated what its vision for internet governance is, it is not exactly the same as the one that is being advocated in Europe. In Europe, they tend to massively prioritize individual privacy, whereas the US has historically really prioritized sort of corporate interests above that. So we need to be clear-eyed about the idea that even as we do want the US and Europe to be working in a convergent direction, that's not going to be possible until the United States first articulates sort of what is its vision for internet governance to include a set of domestic regulations that are going to be a necessary part of that picture, and then engages in some measure of harmonization, again, with the recognition that there's not going to be 100% agreement here, but that if the US and Europe can achieve a substantial or a sufficient degree of consensus about what the future of internet governance should look like, that will at least regulate large swaths of the world in a way that is generally supportive of openness and can also prevent antithetical norms from crystallizing, because even if the US and Europe aren't moving exactly in the same direction, neither of them are moving in the direction of China. And that should be very important in determining sort of the balance of normative power as it relates to these governance questions.
Wonderful. So next pair will be Eric Sand and Zachary Burdett. Eric, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Taylor. Rebecca, great to see you. I really enjoyed your talk. I want to go back to something Renata said and you talked about in your talk, right? I think openness is great marketing, but I want to know what the political and geographic boundaries of openness are, right? The liberal international order started as just in the Western Bloc. A lot of people criticize our existing grand strategy because it allowed the transfer of technology and manufacturing capacity to China, which is the state you're acknowledging we compete with. So is this openness for everyone, or are there implicit boundaries, either politically or geographically, to who would be invited to fully participate in the open order you envision?
Great. Zachary.
Hi, Rebecca. Thanks for the talk. I'm curious to hear more about metrics for evaluating success of this grand strategy. So kind of abstracting away from specific examples and symptoms, like whether we endorse Article 5 and instead turn into kind of broader concepts. How do we actually know a healthy versus collapsing international order when we see it? And how do we know if the US is punching above or below its weight? Because it seems like to know whether we've seen a power transition or whether the order is about to collapse, there's some kind of latent conceptual apparatus informing this like ideal type system or ideal type exercise of power for us to be able to tell whether outcomes are suboptimal. And so then I'm curious, what are these more fundamental yardsticks related to concepts like order and power that can help us figure out if more specific things like UN Security Council reform are really moving us towards these goals and how far?
Great, two excellent questions, and nice to see you both. So first, Eric's question about the boundaries. I would say all are invited to participate in an open order. And we do make a clear distinction between sort of domestic openness and international openness. And I do think that there is some measure of domestic closure that is completely tenable in accompanying participation in international openness. This is basically what we mean when we say that, you know, many different regime types can participate in this order. You don't need to fully liberalize politically, or in many cases, even sort of economically, in order to participate at least in elements of this order. So I would say it is unbounded in terms of its invitation or expansiveness geographically and also functionally. But what's important to recognize is, precisely because of the point I just made about sort of the agnosticism with regards, agnosticism is too strong of a word, but sort of flexibility with regards to regime type. I mean, this is not a strategy that seeks to change the internal character of other regimes, at least until their people decide otherwise. And there, I think it really is a substantial departure from the core assumptions of liberal universalism, which basically predicated the possibility of cooperation on liberalization by illiberal states, whereas we recognize that that's very unlikely. And indeed, there is actually not much that the United States can do to change the internal character of a Russia or a China, and indeed, it shouldn't even try. So openness, defined as interactions between states, is unbounded, but this doesn't imply a quest to impose domestic openness where it doesn't exist right now. To Zach's good question about metrics, I mean, I think this is something that we should all be turning our collective brain power to, especially as it relates to measuring power. Because one of the major arguments we make in this book is that traditional metrics of power are not going to be sufficient in a sort of understanding 21st century geopolitics. I mean, as you all know, we've so often thought about sort of economic power as being the most important form of power, including and especially because it is essentially fungible into military power. But as we consider the future, particularly of, you know, for example, in the tech space, it's pretty clear that technological power, the ability to, you know, come up with cutting edge AI technologies, for example, is not strictly predicted by the size of a country's GDP. Similarly, power in the international development space is not strictly correlated with the size of a country's GDP or its military. And these things are much harder to measure, especially the sort of invisible technological capabilities. So I don't have any silver bullet answer for, you know, how we are able to sort of update our proverbial sync scores to meet this new age. But I do think it's something that we should at least be attuned to in recognizing the multidimensional nature of power going forward and the need to capture it. And then in terms of order, I mean, I think we can measure it in terms of, you know, the institutionalization and the existence of norms to govern those areas that are currently under-regulated. I mean, we can see, for example, in the climate space that the climate regime today is largely ungoverned except by purely voluntary commitments made through the Paris Climate Agreement. We would measure progress by the existence of stronger and more enforceable agreements that would curb emissions. I think that's a pretty clear metric, you know, insofar as there are no global norms surrounding attacks on critical infrastructure today. The development of, you know, a more articulated set of norms, even if they're not institutionalized in that area, would represent ordering progress. So I don't have a set of coding criteria to offer you right off the top of my head, but I do think that's the way to think about it. And certainly progress is measurable.
Great, thanks. So this will be our last pair of questions. So this pair will be Wright Smith and Sarah Plana. Wright, over to you.
Thank you so much. So I was hoping to ask and to push you a bit on this issue of partisanship, because you paint a depressing picture, and if I'm being quite honest, I actually think the picture is worse than what you portrayed, and regardless of the election's outcome, is not going to improve. And so given that, I would just like to ask, is it possible to for the United States to carry out the recommendations that you are proposing while it is in a state of, frankly, very serious domestic crisis?
Thanks. Thanks, right. Sarah?
Hey, Rebecca, it's good to see you, and thanks for your talk. My question relates a little bit to a question that Apeksha asked earlier. I wonder if you can give a little bit more details about how you think China, Russia, and other adversaries are going to respond to an openness strategy, and what the United States should do if they don't respond the ways that we think they will. And I especially think about this in two contexts. One is, how do we concretely promote democracies without exacerbating autocratic insecurity, especially if, for example, partnerships with civil society often lead, which are short of regime change that you've been talking about, often lead adversaries to still fear regime change. And how do we convince our adversaries that we really aren't going to do regime change given decades of doing so, which I think gets to some of the questions about reputation. And then the second thing I was thinking about is many theories are floating about the fact that interference in American elections are aimed to actually increase polarization. So do you actually expect openness to somehow prevent this intervention? Thank you.
So back to you, Rebecca.
Great. Okay, well, let's start with these sort of paired set of polarization questions. I mean, to Sarah's element, hi, Sarah. I don't think that openness will necessarily prevent it in and of itself, but what an openness strategy would do is sort of name foreign electoral interference and political interference as being sort of a key threat in the way that it has not always been defined in the past. And in so doing, establishes a rubric for deterrence by denial and also deterrence by punishment in effect. And so it's not the sort of mere articulation of an openness strategy that would prevent it from happening, but an openness strategy focuses attention on the need to develop a more robust set of responses to foreign interference than the ones that do exist right now. To the other sort of US politics and partisanship question, I mean, I think this is a really serious concern. I think it's a very important issue to raise. And I guess I would isolate a few different responses. I mean, the first is that when you think about implementing this strategy in the near term, it's pretty clear that the overwhelming array of crises that the United States is facing domestically as an urgent matter right now are going to have to take priority, from COVID response, economic recovery, racial justice issues, climate crisis, and in many ways, a democratic integrity crisis that could very much be in the offing as of next week. So to me, the issue is more one of sequencing. We can't really expect the United States or political leadership, if there is new leadership, to turn its attention to matters of grand strategy right off the bat, especially because that domestic reconstruction is in many ways the prerequisite for doing much of this openness strategy. But what I think a new administration could do is articulate a set of priorities, articulate a vision, and try to embed its domestic reconstruction efforts within that vision, and then turning more to issues of long-term strategy as bandwidth allows. But, the other things we can do to try to overcome partisanship and polarization is to lean into areas where consensus continues to exist. We know that the mass public is highly attuned to elite cues. And I do think that having Donald Trump's heterodox views out of office, if that happens, will help restore some measure of bipartisan agreement. And indeed, a significant amount of bipartisan agreement, including on issues like the need for US global leadership that isn't especially militarized, the need to respond to climate change, a little bit less so, American alliances. I mean, all of these do have support from Democrats and Republicans if you look at the polling that Pew does or the Chicago Council does. But the other thing that the US can do, I think, is to try to embed an openness strategy within a broader web of partnerships so that at least elements of it can be self-sustaining, even if it doesn't have top-level political support in Washington. So what I mean by that is to work with allies and partners to articulate what an open world would look like so that they can continue to fight for it, as, for example, Japan and Germany have in many ways done during the Trump years in trying to sort of uphold the liberal international order in America's absence. Public-private partnerships are a way in which private companies can sustain core elements of the strategy in the way way that many of them have committed to elements of sort of climate targets, even as the US has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. Also, state and local governments have substantial regulatory and agenda setting power, especially when you're thinking about the tech pieces of this strategy. So I think that's the best way to try to insulate openness over the longer term from what are certain to be violent partisan winds that continue to blow regardless of what happens next week and in the months that follow. And then very briefly on Sarah's other question about democracy promotion. So I share your view that there is very little that the United States could do that would reassure China or Russia that we're not out for regime change. So I don't really think that we need to predicate our strategy on trying to convince them of that. Basically, what we try to do here is a pivot from any kind of democracy promotion to democracy support, which is to say that the United States should work to consolidate those democracies that do already exist out there in the world, should help to shore them up against political interference, should invest in our own democracy as an exemplar of what a good democracy and effective governance should look like. And we can hold China and Russia to account for those international agreements to which they have already signed on. And impose various forms of costs upon them to the extent that they don't live up to them, whether, when it has to do with China's treatment of Uyghurs or whether it has to do with the Hong Kong national security law, both of which are in violation of agreements that China has already agreed to. But the US certainly does not need to and should not and should be clear about not trying to change the character of either state's regimes until its people might decide otherwise.
Wonderful, thank you. So this will close the live stream portion of the seminar today. I apologize to a few folks who weren't able to ask your questions, but you can stick around and get them in the breakout session.